Hello and most welcome to 1038, and we would today discuss a little bit about how to motivate yourself. And I would say, well, the title is going to be The Spark to Interest, or What Triggers Thinking. That is the most important thing, and it can be very hard to get over the threshold where you have a very little interest or only some interest, and that will make you go only so far. I think at a beginning point when studying Heidegger, Derrida, Paul Feyerabend and other philosophers, we just see them as something we can explain in our older terms, our old established terms. And that is the starting point, I would say. But it's far from the whole way. It is much, much more than that. Because once the interest and the intention somewhere there is sparked, something will happen. And what happens is that you're going from understanding in the old way to understanding in the new way. And to go from one position to the other, you need to have more intention. Intention is incredibly important. And I would say intention is something you can grow. You can grow your intention, your want, your lust for things. It is not something permanent. It can be developed, strengthened, furthered, and it can become incredibly strong in the end. I think I'm going to turn this. I didn't see that I put the sun behind me. Sorry about that. I hope this is a tad better. It's the first spark that we need to develop. That first spark is the start of everything. And once that is set in action, our thinking will become more danken, a thankful business, than the regular boring thinking. Repetitive, energy lacking, gruesome, almost grinding, where you have to put a lot of effort. This is why it's so important to grow the intention, to make it stronger, persistent, convincing for yourself. You need to become convinced yourself. It's very important. You should not waver in your conviction. It should be wholesome, directed with your whole organism, and it should be a want for something better. I will later in this lecture go into what the usual want is, the usual desire or the metaphysics of present. But how that one can be directed in another way to something else. So you can take that energy you spent during the day, daydreaming, mind wandering, fantasizing, wanting, just a sheer desire for something that you know at heart can never be achieved. But that is not a conscious understanding. According to Rodolphe Gasche, the author of The Tain of the Mirror, deconstruction is the finest way of experience the world. And once you develop that skill, it will come naturally to you without any effort. But while you're training, effort needs to be put in. You need to understand the gain in being able to deconstruct. Now, it's important here to understand that the gain is enormous. I would say it doesn't even have limits. And the why question is here something that takes a very important role that it plays. Because the why question shows you into the correct mindset. Because why we understand. It's not a difficult task to understand what why means. And all of a sudden we understand that why is something we never ask. And by putting the why question, everything becomes clear. So that's the amnesia, something we've forgotten to ask. And the amnesia has made us blunt, made us dull to experience. And we got used to that dullness in experience. And that dullness in experience takes away all the energy. It is not satisfying to think anymore. That's the reason danken and danken, thankfulness and thinking used to be the same thing. But no longer today. It is strugglesome, it's gruesome, painful. This is a quote from what happens when you start to deconstruct. All look the same, but everything has changed. All the tools I had, all the thinking I had, it's still there. It is just more effective, stronger, and more real. And this is something that gives health to both body and soul at the very same time. Deconstruction is health personified. We become healthier when our system is working in the way it should be. This is what David Bradel would call a working cerebellum. A cerebellum that becomes sort of an external, like an external tool. There is a similarity there you can point to. And that is training the cerebellum. At first you don't know how to train it. You don't know when you train it. But after some time, couple of months, you will know when you train it, and then let it pass some more time. You will also feel the effects, but you will not immediately notice that your thoughts has become clearer, because that awareness is something of a later progression. You can realize once you got there that you have been unaware, but don't expect that you could be aware of your progress now. But it will still be there. Every time you think, liturgy, rhythm, or other things, you will train the cerebellum to become progressively more skilled in directing the thoughts, sequencing them in a better manner, making them work for you instead of they working against you. That's a difference that is huge. But until you develop to a certain level, you won't even feel the difference. Awareness comes in later. The reflective consciousness, as I mentioned before, the one you have now, cannot be aware. So do not think that you are aware. That is one of the goals. If you already think you are aware, how would you get the intention to master awareness? And you will be stuck. I think that's the main reason that we don't go into these matters. And that is, we think we have a lot of things already. But I mentioned that's called neologism. That you rename what you already have to keep the illusion that there is some sort of progression. It could be mighty convincing, but you need to understand the process is based on science. And that's the only way you can know you're going in the first right direction at the beginning. Do you trust in science? Do you believe that the things discovered about the brain is true? Well, then you get a little intention, then you get some direction to go in that way. Another way of explaining that is the normal way of reality is a static one. I took up that earlier. The static one doesn't have movement. And as you can imagine, once you acquire movement in your thinking and your understanding, you realize that depth is a sort of movement and you cannot see depth directly. It is not like you can see distance in one static moment. It always takes time. And once time gets accepted and you can start to infer it in your perception, it will become much more complicated in an exponential way. The complexity level will be staggering in a very short time. That compared to the static notion that you usually make do with. The static notion gives you no pleasure, no experience, and it makes awareness impossible. And therefore you invent the reflective awareness and you try to convince yourself that you have an awareness. You don't. A non-working cerebellum, a cerebellum that's not trained, will always be non-working, and it won't give any awareness. You cannot be aware of your own thinking. Paavo Pylkkinän points out too in his article, which I'm going to link further down here, how the forgetting the why question is something we do every moment. It is not something only of the past, it is also something that we repetitively do every moment. And that's a double take of first learning to project as we grew up in this civilization. We do not project, we are passive. So the first step in experience is always passivity. It should be there because you grew up in this civilization. And that is not actively projecting vision, hearing, sensing, tactility, kinesthesia, proprioception, smell, and all those other things. We are not trained that. If you live in the world, if you are actively projecting, it means that every moment you perceive something, you will train yourself. We do not do that. That means we need to actively train those things until that they become strong enough, so surely by experience you will train them. But now the training needs to be artificial, so to speak. It won't become natural by itself. That's important to understand, that in a normal situation where you projected all your senses and you were not, so to speak, convinced by the static model of the world, like a two-dimensional flat screen where you can see depth and you can give dimension to that. Once you understand logically that is an illusion, you will start to train your senses. But it will take time, because you're not used to it. You've never done it before. That will in the end become natural, and that means no more artificial training is to be done. Your training period is over. You just have to be presencing, or you don't even have to do that. You will do it automatically. And that is, so to speak, making a conscious effort to establish something that becomes unconscious in the end. But the training will go on, because for every time you get a rewarding experience, automatically the intention will grow. But at this starting level, the intention is so low, you need to forcefully push it for anything to happen. Because all of our ontology, all our thinking, all our knowledge is today absolutely 100% passive. Centrism is our meager tool of trying to convey anything, but that does not work as a conveying method. Centrism doesn't serve its supposedly mission. A little bit like people thought that the people in propaganda institution in Nazi Germany, they affected people and made them more convinced. I think that is very, very hard to believe, truthfully. It's the idea of we being like mushrooms, sucking up everything that is around us. No direction or no convincing will be done if you don't try to convince yourself. You can't be given a convincing superpower through propaganda. That won't give you intention. That will not give you the strength for the direction. But that old passive model sort of confirms itself. Looks on the surface that the little intention that people actually did have, something that they created themselves. No one else can create it for you. Perception can't be given to you, not in that way, and especially not as we have grown up in a culture where passivity is everything. After the projecting comes the second difficult, even more difficult thing, and that needs to be trained as well, and that's the waiting. This is when you listen to the voice of the friend and you let it be. You don't conquer it, you don't give it a name. That is so important. Please remember that. Never ever give a name to the voice. That's a cue. It's a very, very good indicator that will help you understand what it's about. It becomes a habit, that habit you have had all your life. So you will not be aware of it. There's zero chance of you being aware of it. And the second thing is, you will not easily understand it. No one will. You say you understood it, you have not. It takes training. But what we do on a usual level, normal level, is that we capture the object. First we send out the hearing, and then we just capture, kidnap it, make it a possession. And even though that sounds active, it's not, or it's a very low-grade activity. It's a theft. The thing needs to come into reality by itself. And this is nothing but quantum theory. Once you let it come into action, it will be something. It will not be subjective, it will not be objective. It could be both, it could be neither. It could be pointing very clearly to something in a way that exclusion never ever could. Exclusion is a passivity proxy or prothesis. Exclusion is when you don't have the effort, you don't have the intention enough to show something clearly, to say something clearly, and you build it up with these simpler devices that doesn't require energy. Yes, they don't require energy, but it will not be convincing. It will not be satisfying for you, and it will not be convincing for anyone else. And this is sort of exclusion, division, simple tools, sort of ersatz, surrogate for proper understanding. From there also comes the laws or the rules about correctness, those ludicrous rules that are supposed to show people what is the correct thing, what is true. Such laws cannot really exist, and they are not shared either. I would say they are idiosyncratic on an individual level, but worse than that, not even the individual himself or herself will understand what he or she is thinking, saying. And that it is to be unaware. This is the unawareness you have. You must assume you have it. Otherwise you cannot find it. But once experience is let to show itself in a way that is natural, not preemptive, not brutish, not too quickly ask the what, when, where questions. Leaving the object or whatever it is to spring into action, that will be entering into reality, not the capturing that sort of takes away the smell of reality, the depth of reality, the uniqueness of the experience. This is similar to people who think, including me, that every day looks the same, there is not a specific atmosphere to it. Everyday people today are not aware of the shifts in colors, smells, energy, directivity, and all that. We don't know time. We think it's the same always, like empty space-time, Newtonian time. That's the conquest of abundance. This is actually what Paul Feyerabend means. So it's meant on a historical perspective, sort of meant in a philosophical perspective, but it's also something you do every single moment. And it sort of deprives you of experience itself. And once we captured experience preemptively too early, it can be shown in an electroencephalogram, the not very good timing of the cerebellum. Looks odd, looks too strict, too regular to be working, doesn't have enough complexity. The thing that is left, the remains, the skeleton of the nice steak, is that we don't have enough to understand what is happening. We don't have enough to localize ourselves in a way that is safe and durable. There will be no information that would be enabling understanding. And I would like to point to here a certain direction I noticed, something that is constantly recurring, and usually I named it by the Derridian neologism, metaphysics of presence, but can be other ways to point into it. I was thinking of the otherworldly ideas of mathematicians, the Platonic mathematicians. It's also a world of hope. It's this other place, not in this worldly experience, because that is dull. It doesn't say you anything. It doesn't feel. It is distance. You are a bystander. That leads to this urge of realness, and that is the metaphysics of presence. But it can also take different forms. And I would say the otherworldly wishes of Hugh Everett, Max Tegmark. It's a dream of an order he cannot feel, and therefore we create this dream. So in the dream, at least, we think we can have it, or we can at least dream about it. It's a want, it's a wish, and I think that is one of the main reasons, if not the very biggest reason, for the rejection of quantum mechanics, is that it clashes with that wish, that dream world, that want. It destroys the dream world, and it could lead to destruction of the whole, what is left of the individual. So it seems that we have to go into a scary point, horror vacui. What Stephen Amrosen called the apeiron. So many different dreams we make up, and I think one chance that quantum mechanics could sort of surge into society was the late 60s, and this did actually happen. Quantum mechanics became popularized and sort of used by the hippie movement for its own purpose. And although I felt that to be good in the beginning, and I met one of the great authors of those books that also came up, and that was Gary Zukav. I met him in '98, and he was also selling his new book. I don't remember the name, I will find it out, but he's most famous for the Dancing Woolly Masters. And I think these people took quantum mechanics in a bad way, made it into their hope, and didn't go into the depth of what it actually could show, that the real world is the fancy thing. And that went hand in hand for the wish for many of the hippie people and the leaders of the hippie movement to point to drugs of different causes, to show us to a different reality, a more encompassing and more satisfying. And that was such a big thing in the hippie movement. Mescaline, LSD, peyote, grass, mushrooms, you name it. And I think that is the same thing as Max Tegmark's dream, is that this dullness we experience, must be something else. And I would say that the drugs are just the extension of the wish of metaphysics of presence. The why question is not something otherworldly. It's not a mescaline trip, neither is it a peyote vacation in Mexico with Don Juan. It's nothing of the kind. It is actually something that starts right where you are, in the real world. And it's not about making the real world more dreamlike, soft, cloggy, happy. It's making the real world to be realer. It's when we go into the realness of the world. It is when we ask the why question that we actually, for the first time in our lives, also can get the answer for the what and where and the how question. The hippie movement was more of going away from those things, identifying those things as being bad, ontology itself to be something bad, and the regular science bad. Quantum mechanics never said regular science is bad. It's just quantum mechanics is more encompassing and can wholly accept what we already know, but you just get more. It's not a contradiction ever. It's not a negation. Yes, we've been doing a lot of negation in these lectures, but the purpose was to stir the interest. Now the interest is there. Now we don't need criticism anymore. Now we can go directly into it and enjoy the fruits of reality. No one in the New Age movement thought that. So instead of looking to some otherworldly experience that Guru Zukav did, wishing, wanting, you should have gone into the experience you already had. And maybe it could be the case that the hippie movement should never have been. Maybe they should have stayed at home and worked hard. I know I sound like a horrible conservative now, but the thing is, it's in the real world, using logic, using mathematics, using the stuff we already have, but just making them even more. This is walking towards the why question. Not perpetuating the dream. Or you can perpetuate the dream, and the day you really get substance in your reality, it will be what it is. It would be a dream. You can still dream it, but you will have something even better. You will have a reality that is deep. It is the reality of the Renaissance people who could perceive all those colors, who could perceive changes in atmosphere in the passing of the day, which is never ever repeated, ever. Time does not repeat itself in that horrible way. Every moment is different. And we perpetuate that, and that's the same thing as the second leap I showed. When we capture things, we too quickly ask the what, where, why question. And when we do that too quickly, we do not get any answers, because it needs to show itself. And that can never ever be done by drugs. It can be done by training of the cerebellum. But it's not hard to understand that the reward will be a million times more than what you get from drugs. Could even happen that the drugs might show some aspects of reality that you've been lacking. I think that's true. I think that's example what peyote and mescaline does. But the why question in quantum mechanics does so much more than that. Does that? Yes? No? There's no doubt. True real perception is to a part of mescaline and LSD does. There's no question. But this does even more. You develop in such a way you can have that experience all the time. And you don't have to be drugged at the same time, because that is bound to take away some portions of the finer details, or something of the atmosphere of the time, this 3 o'clock in the afternoon, how that is different right in this moment, this day, not in a generalized way, but in this truer way, this real, not generalized way, this true to perception, but also true to reality. And then, of course, there comes an understanding. You can have your very own perception, you can train it, it's yours, but you will also enter in something that is greater, the reality, the other thing, the grander thing. That will also be there. For pigs, like delicious fruits, always possible, never disappearing. Just going to put in a pause here. Let me take something little from the article by Paavo Pylkkinän at the Helsinki University. The theme of phenomenology and quantum physics is here tackled by examining some basic interpretational issues in quantum physics. One key issue in quantum theory from the very beginning has been whether it is possible to provide a quantum ontology of particles in motion in the same way as in classical physics, or whether we are restricted to stay within a more limited view of quantum systems in terms of complementarity but mutually exclusive phenomena. In phenomenological terms, we could describe the situation by saying that, according to the usual interpretation of quantum theory, quantum phenomena require a kind of epoché, and this is having the sense of suspension of assumption about reality at the quantum level. However, there are other interpretations, especially David Bohm's, that seem to reestablish the possibility of mind-independent ontology at the quantum level. We will show that even such ontological interpretations contain novel, non-classical futures, which require them to give a special role to phenomena or appearances. A role not encountered in classical physics. We will conclude that while ontological interpretations of quantum theory are possible, quantum theory implies the need of a certain kind of epoché even for this type of interpretations. While different from the epoché connected to phenomenological description, the quantum epoché nevertheless point to a potentially interesting parallel between phenomenology and quantum philosophy. There has been relatively little discussion in the phenomenological literature about the radical philosophical implications of quantum theory and relativity. One underlying reason for this may have been Husserl's view of phenomenology as first philosophy, emphasizing that philosophy comes before the special sciences, including physics, in the sense that it studies the preconditions of the possibility of our experience of an empirical phenomena. While not without insight and value, such a view of first philosophy may make one less prone to see the new philosophical vistas open up by the empirical sciences, especially physics. There are some leading phenomenologists that have made connections between phenomenology and the new physics, the most well-known example being perhaps Merleau-Ponty, and how he discussed in his nature lectures delivered between 1956 and 60s. One also thinks here about Heidegger's well-known discussions with Heisenberg. More generally, there were developments in already early 20th century phenomenology that implied the possibility and indeed the need to allow the natural sciences to give feedback to the allegedly first phenomenological enterprise. For example, Heidegger famously emphasized the role of a pre-structure of understanding. The idea being that our experience of meaningfulness is always based on background assumptions and pre-established ways of structuring. However, Heidegger also emphasized that we are not prisoners of this pre-structure, as Bachmann describes it. Cite coming up here. The pre-structure is never static, but lives along with a hermeneutical circle of interpretation. In a successful process of interpretation, the target of interpretation forces us to reconsider the concepts and view from which our interpretation starts from, and grasp them in some way, which in turn influences the experience and the interpretation of target. End of cite. Let us assume that our target of interpretation is the new radical results we encounter with quantum and relativistic phenomena, and which physicists first try to understand in terms of classical physics. In an Heideggerian hermeneutical way, we could suggest that these new phenomena forces us to reconsider the classical pre-structures of understanding, to grasp and to modify it, and then experience and interpret the quantum relativistic phenomena in a new, more adequate way. But such a modified pre-structure could then be used not only when dealing with the novel physical phenomena, but also when trying to describe everyday phenomenal experience in general. That's the interesting part. It can also be used to extensive success in everyday life. And this is, of course, was nothing that Gary Zukav or Fritjof Capra or any of the other writers of quantum physics for New Ages or hippie consultants or whatever pointed to. Their take was more crude. It was still a classical physical idea involving it. The hermeneutical way was still classical physical. It didn't change. And I would say you have to be a physicist to do that change. But once it's done, we can all use it. Without a doubt, we can become quantum phenomenologists. by making an epoché of the what, where and when question, we can get an answer of those questions, and yet more, we also get an answer for the why question, the starting point. So there is a great gain here that Paavo Pylkkinän is pointing to. So a quantum phenomenology would then start from first letting the pre-structure of understanding transform, and then proceeding to make novel phenomenological descriptions in the light of this new pre-structure. An example of this is David Bohm's, in the 80s, discussion of time consciousness in the light of notion of implicate order. It is typical of later phenomenology, especially Heidegger, that there is much emphasis on the historical situation one finds oneself in, as well as on the situation and context in which meaningful phenomena unfold. This is definitely another area where connections to quantum and relativistic phenomena seem relevant. Regarding historicity, Heidegger emphasized that philosophy, in citation, is a limited historical phase of Western thinking. As Beckmann describes it, philosophy, in this Heideggerian sense, is metaphysical thinking aiming toward absolute generality that begins with Plato and Aristotle, but which has come to an end especially as the result of the thoughts of Hegel, Marx and Nietzsche. However, quantum and relativistic phenomena may give a new challenge and a possibility for renewal rather than end. Not the end that Nietzsche pointed out to in Gay Science or his other writings. And that would be a renewal of philosophy in this traditional sense. So we can keep philosophy, but it could be renewed from within. And I really like that, the idea of no longer attacking, counter or contradice, because that limits the scope. This goes inside the hermeneutical understanding that we already have. And this is exactly what Julian Barber did, and that was, for me, actually I didn't understand that in the beginning. The reason for I fell for Julian Barber was I could understand it. I didn't realize why I understood it. But the reason why I understood it, he describes his whole theory in terms regular people can understand, because it's still in classical physics. His theory allows for that, more of an expansion of the theory that is already in place, and not by contradicting it. Of course, the title had to be made more interesting than what I'm describing here for obvious reasons. But the end of time, for instance, and the subtitle, which was even more exaggerated. And I would say that was not a good title, because what's inside is actually much more interesting than just the end of time. It's so much more. It is an understanding, and that's the second point which I realized, I would say first now, the last couple of months, that within each theory we can have an expansion. We do not have to contradict it. And he showed that in mathematics, of course with the help of the brilliant Italian mathematician Bertotti, who helped him immensely. But I think he had some sort of idea that while leaving, I'm talking about Julian Barber here, while leaving the normal sphere of physics, not entering into the project of Cambridge or Oxford, he still lingered on, and he kept himself within the frames. and thereby he made his theory accessible for us poor sods living in classical physics. But a second thing, even more interesting, is show that within the current theory, without having to contradict it, without having to overturn it, within that very theory, an expansion was possible. An expansion which made it easier to breathe in the new physics. And this is what Pylkkinän so eminently, he's a good writer as well, is pointing to. And it then becomes a sort of a tool for helping us getting also into to the larger things of classical physics as well. I think that's incredibly interesting. This is going back to the why question. Once we do that, we don't have to contradict theories anymore. We don't have to put them on the garbage bag. We can sort of reuse them. But that's not a perfect term either. We can go inside them and we can inhabit them and make them larger. And I would say, honestly, without Julian Barber, without actually doing it, because it was when I did it, I made the foundation for something that later became an understanding, more aware, verbal understanding. But first I had to do it. And it was a tough time. And of course, if anybody is left listening to these lectures who was in the beginning, well, before we recorded them, there was a 12 lecture series, maybe one of the most ghastly, hard to understand, that took place in Gothenburg 4 years ago, partly by help by Håkan at Light Your Fire. That was an immensity. That was a starting foundation, because when you try something, when you do something, you make the foundation for something that can later be an understanding. And this is the point of Pylkkinän, and that was the point in the beginning of this lecture. Don't try to understand first. First, do it. While doing it, that is sort of the projecting part I mentioned before. And then comes the understanding. But force the understanding and you get neither. And a forced understanding, that's the slavehood we are under since the Greek. Because on a personal plane, it rids us of experience. And that I felt for a long time. When I see Renaissance painting, I know that these people had a richer experience than we do. No doubt about it. Maybe 1 million times richer. They had more access to everything. And of course it was an historical development that was, in a way, inevitable. But now I realized maybe it wasn't completely inevitable, because you can inhabit a theory by opening up. And that thing came from action, a sort of doing. That was the pre-understanding of the quantum mechanics. They did it. Later came the understanding, not the other way around. Do not try to understand it first. First, do it. And I would say that might be one of the most important messages coming from quantum mechanics. And I will dwell more into what Pylkkinän is pointing to, but it's incredibly interesting. And it's very rewarding as well, because it's almost like a cheat to get to understanding. It's not. It's how we always do. But by understanding them, we can start long before we have an understanding in the regular sense, because that will limit the scope. And then understanding will come completely for free, without any trying. It would just be there, since you've done the work already by hand. Because this is how quantum mechanics is done. It's done by hand, still to this day. There is always a hand involved. We haven't left the body, and we never will leave the body. I say thank you very much, and have a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye.